going nowhere. We will spend today if necessary.
The South African Federation of Trade Unions rejects the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill because the bill seeks to liberalize the energy markets and introduce privatization of energy provision in our country, including to affect tariffs and prices, which, in our view, will make price of electricity in the future to be more expensive. Further on, the introduction of this bill will mean that the role of the public sector in the production of electricity diminishes, whilst the role of the private sector rises. This is because they want to replace Eskom's dominance in the production of electricity with the independent power producers, which are basically private companies that are entering the energy market, especially the generation market. So in that context, we know that the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill will bring nothing but a further privatization of energy provision in our country. We are not saying the privatization of Eskom, we are saying the privatization of energy provision, because there is no direct privatization of Eskom in this instance, but eventually, at the end of this process, you'll have a lot of electricity being produced by the private sector, not the public sector. If you look at the submissions made by Eskom to the Presidential Climate Commission, it shows that at the end of 2035, 33.3% of electricity in the country will be produced by Eskom, as opposed to between 84 to 89 of electricity they are producing at the current moment. That shows you that the Eskom, as a public entity, would have a diminished role in the production of electricity, and there will be a dominance by the private sector companies called the IPPs. The Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill will implement the privatization of energy provision in the following. And this is the very essence of the liberalization of the energy market. So in Section 30, there's an insertion that they are going to introduce, or rather establish, a company called the Transmission System Operator. This company has already been established and has been registered last year in September, October as a state-owned enterprise, which will mainly deal with the buying of electricity from the producers of electricity, the generators of electricity, who in this instance, if we are to take the envisioned and the projections of electricity producers in this country, will be 33% Eskom and 66% the private sector. So in that context, the establishment of the transmission system operator will be a company existing on its own, and this company, within it will be located what we call the Central Purchasing Agency, which will then buy the electricity produced by the independent power producers and by Eskom, and after buying it, sell it to the end users, who are the consumers. In this instance, it will be business and households and whoever might be looking to use energy. So in that context, you have the TSO. Now, we are saying the TSO is a furtherance of the plans, not only of privatization, but of the unbundling of Eskom. Because if you remember, Eskom is a vertically integrated company, which has the generation, which has transmission and distribution. So as a vertically integrated company, the unbundling vision, which had been long devised by the government in its drive to try to liberalize and privatize the energy market, was to ensure that they break these divisions into separate entities out of Eskom. And this is what they are doing. And they are actually moving ahead despite the opposition from the trade union movement and other civil society organizations and other formations of the working class that are opposed to the privatization of energy provision. So the establishment of the TSO is, on the one hand, the furtherance of the unbundling of Eskom, but on the other, it is also creating an economic framework or a business framework for the privatization of energy provision, especially in the generation market, because by creating a TSO as an independent entity, it therefore means that you are dismantling Eskom's monopoly in that, but also you are actually inviting various other producers of electricity to sell that electricity into the TSO, who will be responsible to sell it to the distributors. Ownership is linked to pricing, and the liberalization that is encapsulated in this bill will mean that inevitably there has to be changes, or rather impact, on the tariffs and pricing of electricity to the end users. So let's evaluate the impact on pricing looking at two eras. The first era should be the current moment, that is in the intermediate period, and the other period should be in the long term. Now, in the intermediate period, the impact of the introduction of independent power producers in the energy generation market is already seen to be contributing to the escalation of electricity tariffs. Because if you look at the tariff request which was submitted to NERSA by ESCOM in late 2023, we see there that 21.6% of that pricing and of that tariff was requested to meet the costs which were requested by the independent power producers. And mind you, the independent power producers at the current moment have not yet been proliferated. So they are not too many. They are just few, but they are contributing significantly into the pricing of electricity to the consumers. Now, in the long term, we have to look at this in the manner in which capital functions, because the liberalization means we're handing back the energy generation into the private sector, and they have to act capitalistically like any other business and capitalist enterprise. So the pricing in the long term, in our view, will unfold as follows. The tendency of capitalism, as witnessed historically, shows that capitalism and capitalist enterprises always tends towards concentration of capital and centralization of capital. In other words, even though the market might start with a variety and plethora of various enterprises competing and producing electricity, thus having some downward pressures on the price of electricity, in the long term, what we are going to experience is that many other companies are going to find it problematic whenever they are outcompeted by their own peers in that particular market. In other words, many companies that are outcompeting their competitors will tend towards buying of those particular entities. And buying those particular entities will mean that the market players are continuously shrinking. And shrinking the market players in the market means that we are tending towards oligopolies and monopolies. And it is going to be a problem if you have oligopolies and monopolies that are not publicly owned, but that are privately owned, because they are geared towards profit. And all the time, they will attempt to ensure that they maximize their profits. And the way to maximize profits will mean they, as oligopolies say, have to collude together to influence the pricing of electricity to the end users, the consumers. And once we have these oligopolies taking the generation market, what we are going to end up with is not a perfect competition, but an imperfect competition in which these fewer private players in the energy market are now the price makers, no longer the price takers, as it would have been the case at the time when there were plethora of business enterprises in the energy generation market. This, in our view, leads to nothing but higher price of electricity in the future, and will actually increase what we call the energy poverty. The reason we argue that this is going to increase energy poverty is because in our country, we have energy poverty in the main contributed to by two things. The first one is access to the electricity grid. Electricity grid means the number of houses that are connected to the power lines. That is the first element that speaks to energy poverty. The second factor that contributes to energy poverty is, of course, affordability. Now, at the current moment, insofar as access is concerned, we have the General Household Survey showing that more than 89 to 91% of households in this country are connected to the grid. So there's still a significant number of households, 9% in the main, or over 9% in the main, that are not connected to the grid. So their energy poverty is exacerbated by the fact that they are not connected to that grid. There is no access. But the second element that contributes to energy poverty is actually the prices, because we speak about affordability. Now, if the liberalization of the energy markets in the future and even in the intermediate period tends towards increasing the price of electricity, it therefore means that many and many more of our households are not able to afford electricity, and that is the reason why they are actually doing some form of energy mix in their own households by buying paraffin and having gas stove and buying a little bit of electricity, so that electricity is only used to power the fridge and the lights. And when they cook, they use gas or they use paraffin. This shows you that our people cannot afford electricity, and that is the reason why they resort to energy mix in their households, which, by the way, may have detrimental effects on their health, as we know with paraffin stoves, as we know with gas. The inhalation of the two fossil fuels that are used to power in our homes have huge detrimental health effects on the health of our people. So in this instance, we are saying that the liberalization will then, by increasing the price of electricity in the future, will also contribute to energy poverty. In the midst of all this, SAFTU wrote a submission to Parliament last year in July, August. In that submission, we opposed the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill, and we stated the same reasons we outlined here, that the problem that is being posed here is that of dismantling public ownership of energy production and the ultimate domination of energy provision by the public sector. The second one we are raising is, of course, in opposition to the establishment of the transmission system operator, which in our view is just a vehicle to ensure that the liberalization take place. But we also are opposed what we call, or what is called in the bill, the risk return tariff. In other words, that the businesses that are going to be allowed to operate in the energy generation market are going to have to sell electricity at profit making. So it is guaranteeing them of profits. So in the first place, it guarantees them the market because the central purchasing agency is obligated to buy from these entities, but also it is guaranteeing them that it will buy at the tariff that is profitable to these companies, which is just a nightmare and a mess and a disaster for the future. So having said these things in the submission to Parliament, SAFTU also thinks that the solution is the public pathway. In our view, a public pathway means that in order for us to solve the energy crisis we're having at the current moment, we've got to fix the current coal fleet that is owned by Eskom. Now, if we focus on maintenance of Eskom's coal fleet, we are going to surely be able to recover energy that is being lost unnecessarily and be able to beat the interruptions that are caused to power provision in our country. The second element of this public pathway is that we've got to ensure that Eskom is not unbundled, that Eskom is left intact as it is, that is, as a vertically integrated company with 3 divisions, because only in that we are able to know that electricity is provided as a public good, even though it is sold for Eskom to be able to recoup some of the costs. But we know that it is not sold necessarily for profit making, but is sold as a public good to prop up the economy and ensure that our households have electricity. So we think that the public pathway ought to insist on retaining Eskom as a vertically integrated company. The other element which we think forms part of the public pathway for a solution to the energy crisis in our country is on the basis of the renewables. We think that instead of championing renewables through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, has been privatizing energy production in this country since 2011. We think that the opposite ought to be the reality, and that is Eskom has to invest in renewable capacity. The renewable capacity should not be auctioned to the independent power producers, but must be championed by Eskom itself.